The basics of how APIs work again. We have a request made from something, say your computer or cell phone, to a program on a computer. We don't know where the computer is located. And the response is made with what is requested. This is the basics of how APIs work. Request made to a program, program responds with what we requested. For example, www.google.com, sent to a Google computer, comes back with the Google web page. This is very simple. We need to know more details than this. When this is done over the internet, that is when an API is done over the internet, then what is it? Do you remember? It's a web service. So all web services are APIs, but not all APIs are web services. That is, not all APIs use the internet. When talking about APIs, though, people are generally talking about web services, calling APIs over the internet. And if we're calling APIs over the internet, we call this computer using something called HTTP, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It also sends back us a response in HTTP. So we have to know what HTTP is to understand web services and the details of how APIs work. So let's get into HTTP. What is HTTP? First, let's go over the term. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What does this mean? What's hypertext? Let's look at the first term. Well, let's look at regular text. What is regular text? Let's put in www.google.com. That's regular text. What does regular text do? Nothing, right? It's just text. What makes this special? HTTP makes it special. It turns it into hypertext, meaning that this text can go somewhere else. Hypertext, hyper to somewhere else. So when you put in www.google.com into your search engine, Internet Explorer, or Firefox, or Chrome browser, then it automatically starts it with HTTP or HTTPS. S just means extra security encryption. Same thing, just extra security. This thing enables this to go to a Google computer. It makes this hypertext. How it's done is the transfer protocol. That specifies how it's done. So we have to go over the hypertext transfer protocol to understand behind the scenes what's happening here and to understand web services. So let's get into HTTP. First, let's get into the request part of it. Like when we do, this is a computer, and we're sending over a request using HTTP. What parts are in the HTTP? Sent to a computer somewhere, computer program. What parts? What do we need to include? One is what's called the start line. That starts the program, tells it what to do. Two are headers. That provides additional information other than the start line. 3 is a blank line. And 4 is a body where we can send it information, actual information. Don't worry about the details yet. Just recognize that there are 4 parts. This line is mandatory, the start line. The rest of these are not mandatory. Obviously, blank line is nothing. So you don't need headers, you don't need a body. What happens in the what happens in the response? How does this change? What happens in the HTTP response? Nothing changes. It still uses these 4. Same thing. So when sending a request using HTTP or sending a response using HTTP, it uses these 4 both times. These 4 parts in HTTP. So let's get into more detail about these 4 parts. Let's look at these 4 HTTP parts in more detail. HTTP, the 4 parts. We have the start line, right? What comes after that? Headers. What's after that? Blank line. What's after the blank line? Body. We have our request, HTTP request. We have our HTTP response. What's in the start line of request and response? The HTTP version. In this case, HTTP 1.1. That's what everybody's using. There's an HTTP 2 out there, but nobody's really using it yet, and there's no reason for you to look into it. Just think about HTTP version 1 because that's what everybody's using. They might move on to HTTP version 3. They're trying to finish 2 to move on to version 3. That's how bad 2 is. So everybody's sticking with 1. Same thing in the response. You mentioned the version, HTTP 1.1. In the request, you also mention the method. There are lots of methods, but generally only 4 are used. That's get, which means get information, post, which means create information, put, which means change information, and delete, which means delete information. Those are the main methods being used. In the response, in addition to the HTTP version, you also have the status code, which tells you whether or not the API transaction worked. If it comes back with a status code in the 200s, then it worked great. If it comes back with a status code in the 400s, it means that from where you sent it to, that is your computer or your cell phone, there was a problem. If it comes back with status code in the 500, it means from where it went to, that is the Google computer or eBay computer, wherever the API is located, wherever the program is located, there was a problem there. We'll get into this later. Don't worry about the details. Headers. This is additional information other than the start line. So an example of a header is a host. This is where you specify the URL domain. For example, www.google.com. So host is a header. Another example of a header is token. For example, if the API has security, then you can specify the token here. Or you can specify the username and password. Each line is a header. That's why it's called headers with an S, not header. You can specify a whole bunch of lines. What about in the response? What kind of things are in the header? What kind of headers are in the response? Cookie. I know all of you love cookies out there, so they can send over many cookies. You send over this cookie, create another header, cookie, send over as many cookies as they want. They could also specify how big the file is that they're sending. They could also specify what they're sending back, that is HTML. They're going to give you back all these headers, lines. So headers is a bunch of lines. Next we have the blank line, which contains nothing. It just separates the header from the body so that the program knows what's the header and next what's the body. Otherwise it wouldn't be able to tell what's a header and what's a body, right? Unless there's a blank line separating it. So what's in the body when sending a request? Well, if we're using the get method where we're just getting information, nothing is in the body. But let's say we're using the post method where we're creating information. For example, let's say we're creating a new email account where we specify our username, we specify our password. Well, in the body is the username and the password, right? We specify that in the body. And in the response is what we requested. For example, www.google.com, in the body is the HTML web page. One more thing, we talked about parameters. Remember, we talked about www.google.com/search $Q equals tuna. You remember that? Where does that go? Let me create some space here. Parameters and folders go in the start line. So here we have our host, www.google.com, and then we have our folder, which is search, right? And then we have a parameter, Q equals tuna. So it's a little strange, but the host, the domain, is located as a header. And the folder within that host, as well as parameters, are in the start line. So now that I've gone over this on a whiteboard, it might be a little jumbly in your head. You probably don't understand it all. Now I'll go over it in PowerPoint slides more concretely. But just get the general idea. HTTP includes a start line, headers, a blank line, and a body. Only the start line is mandatory. Exercise time. Let's go over what we learned about HTTP. An API done over the internet is called a what? Put it on pause if you don't know. It is a web service. Next, spell out HTTP in words. Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What are the four parts of HTTP? The start line, headers, blank line, and body. Last, how many lines can you have in the headers section? As few or as many as you want, from 0 to many. Now that we've gone over HTTP using a whiteboard, let's go over it in detail using PowerPoint. Again, the four parts of HTTP are start line, headers, blank line, and body. We will go into each one of these in detail. Let's start out with start line.